50 million minds. That is the exact number of human beings 22-year-old king managed to psychologically dominate. If you give this video just 15 minutes of focus today, you will unlock the exact dark psychological blueprint behind his power. You will learn to decode real-world manipulation, protect your mind from toxic environments, and build an unshakable authority. This is a cold autopsy of human surrender. In any room you walk into, here are the 7 hidden psychological mechanisms Alexander used to control the ancient world. 1. The illusion of inevitability. Alexander understood a terrifying reality about human nature. People do not need to be physically defeated to surrender. They only need to believe that resistance is completely hopeless. Once the mind breaks, the body follows automatically. Alexander carefully built an illusion of absolute inevitability around his image before many of his enemies ever saw his soldiers appearing on the horizon. They had already been mentally paralyzed by carefully engineered stories. They heard of massive armies destroyed in an afternoon, entire cities collapsing into dust in days, and kings begging for mercy on their knees. His legend moved significantly faster than his army. By the time his enemies finally looked Alexander in the eyes, fear had already entered their biological systems. Fear forces people to hesitate. Hesitation destroys confidence, and a lack of confidence turns strong men into obedient followers. The actual battle was just a formality, because the psychological war was already won. 2. Tactical trauma and guilt inversion. His most dangerous manipulation was never used against his enemies. It was deployed directly against his own people. During a march through a blinding, deadly desert wasteland, temperatures were unbearable, and water vanished completely. Thousands of hardened soldiers were collapsing from raw dehydration, their lungs literally filling with hot sand. The men were furious, openly blaming Alexander for leading them into a slow death. Out of pure ego, they were hours away from a violent, bloody mutiny. Right at the peak of this tension, a scout found a microscopic amount of water inside a rock, scooped it into a metal helmet, and brought it directly to the king. The entire army stopped moving. Thousands of parched, bleeding soldiers stared silently, waiting to see what their king would do. Alexander slowly lifted the helmet, looked across the sea of his dying men, and violently poured every single drop directly into the sand. Mainstream history calls this great leadership, but psychologically, it was a master stroke of dark manipulation. Alexander knew that logic does not control desperate people, raw emotion does. If he drank it, his men would have murdered him for his greed. If he gave it to a few chosen officers, the army would have fractured into warring factions. Instead, he manufactured an inescapable wave of psychological guilt. His soldiers suddenly saw a king choosing to suffer the exact same agony right beside them. Their murderous rage collapsed instantly into deep, suffocating shame. They felt entirely unworthy of his sacrifice, and their fanatical loyalty returned, stronger than any speech ever could. 3. The speed of cognitive panic. Alexander understood the psychological power of absolute velocity. His armies did not just march, they vanished and reappeared, moving with a terrifying speed that completely defied the logistics of the ancient world. This was not just a military strategy, it was non-stop psychological warfare. Because of his speed, target cities had absolutely no time to prepare their defenses, and threatened leaders had zero time to think rationally. Panic spread through a territory weeks before Alexander even arrived. When the human mind cannot predict what happens next, its cognitive functions become completely unstable. Unstable people are incredibly easy to take control of He wanted his enemies completely overwhelmed and mentally broken before the first sword was ever drawn. 4. Identity, deconstruction, and cosmic gaslighting. To build an empire that would last, Alexander wanted more than simple political obedience. He wanted cosmic submission. After conquering Egypt, he undertook a dangerous, desperate journey deep into the lawless desert to visit a famous, isolated oracle. When he returned to his camp, the entire narrative of his existence had shifted. The high priests declared that Alexander was not an ordinary human man born of a human father. They claimed he was the literal biological son of a supreme god. This single-engineered idea completely reconstructed the psychology of his empire. Now questioning Alexander's military decisions no longer felt like a political disagreement. It felt like dangerous, terrifying blasphemy against the universe. His followers stopped seeing him as a human being, and once people stop seeing a leader as human, they completely lose the ability to judge them normally. 5. Behavioral conditioning and status manipulation. Alexander pushed this psychological conditioning to its absolute limit. By altering the cultural baseline of his inner circle, he forced his oldest, most battle-hardened European generals to perform a Persian ritual called prosgenesis, which required them to bow completely flat on the stone floor whenever he entered a room. He surrounded himself with overwhelming ceremony, golden armor, dramatic royal entrances, and intense public rituals of absolute authority. This was not random vanity. It was systematic, cold behavioral conditioning. He wanted everyone in his presence to constantly feel small. He understood what modern psychology proves today, that human beings react emotionally to status and symbols long before they can process logic. Appearance shapes belief, and belief shapes absolute blind obedience. 6. The architecture of isolation. As his empire expanded to an unmanageable size, Alexander became increasingly paranoid. He feared betrayal around every corner, so he decided to build an architecture of terror inside his own inner circle. One of his most trusted, highly decorated commanders was accused of a shadow conspiracy based entirely on unproven rumors. Alexander did not just execute him behind closed doors. He had him tortured publicly on a rack, breaking his body in front of his peers. Soon after, Alexander secretly ordered the brutal murder of the commander's innocent father, who happened to be Alexander's top, most legendary military general. The entire empire was frozen in shock. Suddenly, nobody felt safe, and that was exactly the psychological point. Fear isolates people. Terrified people stop trusting each other. They stop speaking honestly in private, and they stop questioning authority because their survival becomes significantly more important than the truth. Alexander successfully transformed mutual loyalty into paralyzing fear and used that fear to lock down his throne. 7. Tactical withdrawal and the forward escape. His most brilliant manipulation happened near the very end of his campaigns. After 8 grueling years of continuous warfare, his exhausted, homesick army finally broke. At the edge of the known world, the soldiers refused to take another single step forward. They sat on their shields and openly wept, begging to go home to see their families. Any ordinary ruler would have panicked or threatened them with punishments. Alexander did something infinitely smarter. He used the power of complete withdrawal. He turned around, walked into his royal tent, and disappeared. For 3 straight days, he locked himself away. He refused to eat, he refused to see his top generals, and he spoke to absolutely no one. Slowly, the psychological atmosphere of the entire camp began to curdle. The soldiers became deeply uneasy, restless and terrified. For 8 long years, Alexander had been the central sun around which their entire reality rotated. By completely removing his presence, he forced them to face a sudden, horrifying emptiness they felt, like abandoned children lost in a hostile land. The absolute silence became an unbearable psychological pressure. On the fourth day, Alexander finally emerged from his tent and calmly agreed to return home. But there was a hidden trap. He deliberately chose a brutal, unexplored, highly dangerous wilderness route back. Even while giving the soldiers exactly what they demanded, he forced them to depend entirely on his authority just to survive the journey. He gave them their freedom, but packaged it inside a nightmare. The modern Matrix Alexander did not only conquer land, he conquered human perception. He made the world believe he was inevitable. And once enough minds believe a narrative, it becomes reality. That was his true power. Not his armies, not his swords, but his mastery of dark psychology. And even today, those exact same methods are actively running all around you. Modern corporations, political leader structures, viral algorithms, and social media influencers still use fear, status, identity, and raw emotion to secretly shape your daily behavior. The digital tools changed, but human nature did not. That is why Alexander still matters, because understanding how he manipulated minds in the past helps you decode how the modern world is manipulating your choices right now. And once you finally see the psychological pattern, you stop being controlled by it.